Some people say forgiveness is divine. But what happens when the people who should love you most prove they never really knew you at all? My name is Catherine Powell, though everyone who truly knows me calls me Kathy. I'm 73 years old, and I've spent the better part of my life believing that family comes first, that love conquers all disappointments, and that good intentions eventually reveal themselves. I was wrong about so many things. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What I'm about to share with you happened just 3 months ago, on what should have been one of the most sacred days of my year. It's a story about expectations, about the gifts we give and the ones we withhold, and about discovering that sometimes the people we think we know best are actually strangers wearing familiar faces. Most importantly, it's about the moment I realized that respect isn't inherited. It's earned, even from your own children. The morning light filtered through my kitchen window the way it always did on March 15th, casting long golden shadows across the ceramic tiles that Harold had installed himself 42 years ago. His birthday. Even now, 5 years after losing him, I still woke up on this day with that familiar flutter in my chest, the same anticipation I'd felt for 37 years of marriage. Some traditions, I've learned, outlive the people who created them. I stood at my kitchen counter, the same avocado green formica that Harold always promised we'd replace but never did, and carefully arranged the ingredients for his favorite German chocolate cake. My hands moved with practiced precision, measuring flour and cocoa powder, cracking eggs into the ceramic bowl my mother had given me as a wedding gift. The ritual had become sacred to me, not just the baking, but the remembering that came with it. Harold had been a simple man with simple pleasures. He never wanted elaborate celebrations or expensive gifts. What he treasured most were moments, quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, evening walks around our neighborhood, and most of all, our annual birthday picnic at Riverside Park. It started the year we were too broke to afford dinner, at a restaurant. I'd packed sandwiches and store-bought cookies, worried he'd be disappointed. Instead, he'd looked at me with those warm brown eyes and said, "Kathy, this is perfect. Just you, me, and nowhere else to be." From that day forward, no matter what else was happening in our lives, job changes, money troubles, the chaos of raising 3 children, March 15th meant Riverside Park. We'd spread our old quilt under the oak tree by the pond, and Harold would insist on feeding the ducks, even though the signs clearly stated not to. "Rules are for people who don't understand joy," he'd say with that mischievous grin that had first caught my attention at a church social in 1962. As I folded the cake batter, memories washed over me like warm honey. I remembered the year our eldest, Michael, was 8, and complained bitterly about having to spend his Saturday at a boring park instead of watching cartoons. Harold had surprised him by bringing a kite, and they'd spent hours getting it airborne, both of them covered in grass stains and laughter. I thought about the time our daughter Sarah, then 16 and mortified by her parents' existence, had reluctantly joined us and ended up having such a good time that she brought her boyfriend the following year. Our youngest, David, had always been Harold's shadow. Even as a grown man with children of his own, he'd never missed a birthday picnic. He'd inherited his father's love for those quiet moments, that ability to find contentment in simple things. Or so I had believed. After Harold's funeral, I'd assumed the tradition would end. How do you celebrate someone's birthday when they're no longer there to blow out the candles? But as March 15th approached that first year, I found myself unable to let it go. I baked his cake, packed his favorite sandwiches, and drove to Riverside Park alone. I sat under our oak tree, told him about my week, and left a piece of cake for the ducks. It felt right, like he was still there listening to my rambling stories about the neighbors and my garden. The children had found out about my solo pilgrimage. Through David, who'd seen me at the park quite by accident. They'd been horrified. "Mom, you can't sit alone at a park talking to yourself," Sarah had scolded over the phone. "People will think you've lost your mind." Michael had been more blunt. "It's unhealthy, Ma. Dad's gone. You need to accept that and move on." But David had understood, or I thought he had. "If it brings you comfort, Mom, then keep doing it," he'd said. "But next year, let us come with you. Dad would want us to be together on his birthday." That conversation had happened 4 years ago, and true to his word, my children had joined me every year since. Well, physically they'd been there. Michael usually spent most of the time on his phone, fielding calls from his law office. Sarah would complain about the sun, the bugs, the uncomfortable ground, and how the park really wasn't suitable for someone of her professional stature. But they came, and I convinced myself that their presence, however reluctant, was enough. David was different. He'd sit with me under the oak tree, help me spread the quilt, and even brought his own children the last 2 years. His wife, Jennifer, would pack additional snacks and actually seemed to enjoy the tradition. I'd begun to hope that perhaps Harold's spirit lived on in our youngest son, that the values we'd tried to instill had taken root in at least one of our children. This year felt different from the moment I opened my eyes. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. I'd been planning for weeks, preparing not just the usual picnic, but something special, something that would honor Harold's memory in a way I'd never done before. Hidden in my bedroom closet, wrapped in tissue paper and stored in the cedar box that had belonged to my grandmother, was Harold's gift. Not something I'd bought for him. That would have been pointless and more than a little strange. This was something I'd been saving, something precious that I'd kept close to my heart for 5 long years, waiting for the right moment to share it with our children. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with wax the way Harold had always sealed important documents. Inside were papers that would change my children's lives, documents that represented Harold's final gift to the family he'd worked so hard to provide for. It was his last love letter to us, his way of ensuring that even in death, he could still take care of the people who mattered most to him. I'd debated for months about when and how to share it. Harold's birthday seemed perfect, a celebration of his life and his continuing love for us. I imagined their faces when they realized what he'd left for them, the way their eyes would light up with surprise and gratitude. I pictured us sitting together under the oak tree, reading his words aloud, feeling his presence in a way we hadn't since the funeral. As I slid the cake into the oven, I allowed myself to imagine their reactions. Michael would probably cry, though he'd try to hide it behind his lawyer's stoicism. Sarah would be speechless for once, too moved to complain about anything. And David, sweet David, who'd inherited so much of his father's heart, would understand immediately how much thought Harold had put into this final gesture. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of chocolate and coconut, and I felt Harold's presence so strongly, it was as if he were standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders the way he used to when I cooked. "They're going to love it, Kathy." I could almost hear him whisper, "This is exactly what they need." I spent the rest of the morning preparing everything else with the same meticulous care I'd always brought to Harold's birthday celebrations. I made his favorite egg salad sandwiches, cutting off the crusts the way he liked them. I prepared fresh fruit salad with extra strawberries because he'd always said they reminded him of summer kisses. I packed the thermos with sweet tea, his preferred beverage for outdoor occasions, and wrapped everything in the wicker basket we'd received as a wedding gift. The quilt came next, the same patchwork creation my mother had made for us during our first year of marriage. It had seen countless picnics, served as a fort for the children during their imaginative games, and provided comfort during difficult times. Some of the squares were faded now, and there was a small stain from where Michael had spilled grape juice during a family camping trip 20 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was ours, part of our family's story, and it belonged at Harold's birthday celebration. As I folded the quilt carefully into the basket, I thought about legacy and what we leave behind when we're gone. Harold had been a good man, not perfect, but genuinely kind, hardworking, and devoted to his family. He'd coached Little League for 12 years, not because he loved baseball, but because his children were playing. He'd volunteered at the fire department, served on the church board, and never missed a school play or recital, even when work was overwhelming. More than his actions, though, Harold had taught by example. He'd shown our children what it meant to keep your word, to treat others with dignity, to find joy in simple moments. He demonstrated that love wasn't just a feeling but a choice you made every day, especially when it was difficult. I'd believed, perhaps naively, that these lessons had taken root in our children, that they carried forward his values even if they expressed them differently than he had. The timer chimed, pulling me from my reflections. I removed the cake from the oven, its surface golden and perfect, and set it on the cooling rack. While it cooled, I prepared the coconut pecan frosting from scratch, just as Harold's mother had taught me during our engagement. Some recipes, like some traditions, were too precious to modify or shortcut. By early afternoon, everything was ready. The cake sat proudly on its glass pedestal, decorated with simple elegance rather than elaborate designs. The picnic basket held our feast. The quilt was folded neatly beside it, and Harold's special gift waited in my purse, safely enclosed in its protective envelope. I'd asked the children to pick me up at 2 o'clock. Michael had suggested I could drive myself, but David had insisted they come together as a family. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he'd said, and my heart had swelled with pride at his thoughtfulness. Perhaps I'd raised my children better than I sometimes feared. I changed into the dress Harold had always loved, a soft blue cotton with tiny white flowers that he'd said brought out my eyes. I'd kept it all these years, though it was probably out of style now. Fashion had never mattered much to Harold. He'd always preferred authenticity to trends, substance to appearance. I hoped that preference had influenced our children, though I sometimes wondered if the world had changed too much for such simple virtues to survive. Standing before my bedroom mirror, I saw an old woman looking back at me, but not a defeated one. My hair had gone completely silver, and there were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when Harold was alive. But there was still strength in my posture, still purpose in my movements. I wasn't ready to become invisible just because I was 73. I had stories to tell, love to give, and apparently, gifts to bestow. The gift. I picked up the envelope. Again, running my fingers over Harold's careful handwriting. He'd always had beautiful penmanship, a lost art in our digital age. The weight of the envelope reminded me of its importance, of the careful planning that had gone into its contents. Harold had spent months working on this, consulting with lawyers and financial advisors, making sure every detail was perfect. He'd told me about it during his final weeks, when the cancer had made it clear that our time together was ending. "I want to take care of you and the kids even after I'm gone," he'd said, his voice weak but determined. "This will ensure that everyone I love is provided for." He'd made me promise to wait for the right moment to share it, to choose a time when the family was together and could appreciate not just the gift, but the love behind it. 5 years had felt like long enough to wait. The children were established, in their lives now, old enough to understand and appreciate their father's foresight. Michael's law practice was successful but demanded long hours and created stress. Sarah's real estate career was thriving, but she'd mentioned recently how expensive private school was becoming for her twins. David was doing well as a teacher, but teachers' salaries didn't stretch far, especially with 3 children and a mortgage. Harold's gift would ease those pressures, would allow them to pursue dreams they might have set aside for practical reasons. More than the financial impact, though, it would show them how much their father had loved them, how he'd continued to think about their welfare even as his own health declined. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Michael's black Mercedes followed by David's practical Honda, both vehicles reflecting their owners' personalities in ways that would have amused Harold. He'd driven the same pickup truck for 15 years, not because he couldn't afford something newer, but because it still ran well and served its purpose. A vehicle is meant to get you from one place to another, he'd always said. Everything else is just showing off. I gathered my purse, checked that the envelope was secure inside, and took one last look around my kitchen. Everything was ready. The basket sat by the door, the cake was carefully boxed for transport, and I'd even remembered to bring Harold's favorite folding chair. The one he'd insisted was more comfortable than any bench or blanket. Through the window, I watched my children emerge from their cars. Michael looked impeccable as always, his suit probably costing more than I spent on groceries in a month. Sarah appeared stressed, checking her phone even as she walked toward the house. David seemed rushed but smiled when he saw me watching from the window. My heart filled with anticipation as I opened the door to greet them. This was going to be a perfect day, a celebration worthy of Harold's memory, and a gift-giving moment that would strengthen our family bonds. I had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, everything I believed about my children and our relationships would be shattered beyond repair. "Ready for Dad's big day, Mom?" David called out cheerfully as he approached the porch. "More ready than you know," I replied, my hand unconsciously touching my purse where Harold's precious envelope waited. "This year is going to be very special." I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, though not in any way I could have imagined. The ride to Riverside Park began with the same comfortable chaos that had defined our family gatherings for decades. Michael drove his Mercedes with the precision of someone who treated every journey like a business appointment, while Sarah fidgeted in the passenger seat, her manicured fingers dancing across her phone screen in a rhythm I'd grown to recognize as her default state of existence. David followed behind us in his Honda, and through the rear window, I could see Jennifer in the passenger seat, their youngest daughter, Emma, bouncing excitedly in her car seat. I sat in the back of Michael's car, the precious envelope secure, in my handbag, watching the familiar streets of our neighborhood roll past. Spring had arrived early this year, and the dogwood trees were already blooming in spectacular cascades of white and pink. Harold would have loved seeing them like this. He'd always said that March in Virginia was God's way of reminding us that beauty could emerge from the harshest winters. "Traffic's lighter than I expected," Michael commented, his eyes focused, on the road ahead. His voice carried that particular tone he used when he was mentally somewhere else, probably reviewing case files or preparing for Monday morning meetings. Success in his law firm had come at a cost I wasn't sure he fully understood yet. When had my son become someone who viewed a family tradition as another item to check off his schedule? Sarah finally looked up from her phone long enough to glance at her watch. "Good, because I have a showing at 4:30. The Hendersons are flying in from Atlanta specifically to see the Riverside Manor property, and this could be a huge commission." She turned slightly toward me, and I caught a glimpse of the impatience she was trying to hide. "Mom, we'll need to keep today fairly brief, okay? This is a really important client." The words stung more than I expected them to. Brief. As if honoring her father's memory was something that could be efficiently scheduled between more pressing obligations. I felt the weight of Harold's envelope in my purse and wondered if I was making a mistake. Perhaps they weren't ready for what I had planned to share with them. Perhaps they'd moved too far away from the values Harold and I had tried to instill in them. "Of course, dear," I heard myself saying, though inside I felt a familiar disappointment settling in my chest like a cold stone. "We wouldn't want to interfere with business." Michael caught my tone in the rearview mirror and attempted damage control. What Sarah means is that we want to make sure we have quality time together without feeling rushed. Right, Sarah? Sarah was already back to her phone, typing furiously. She murmured without looking up. Quality time. Absolutely. I turned my attention to the window, watching the landscape change from suburban neighborhoods to the more natural setting that surrounded Riverside Park. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and green. This drive had always been a transition for me, a journey from the ordinary world into a space that belonged specifically to Harold and our family. When the children were young, this 15-minute drive had been filled with excited chatter about what games they'd play at the park, arguments over who got to feed the ducks, and Harold's terrible jokes that made them groan and giggle in equal measure. Now the car felt hollow despite being full of people. We were all present in body, but our hearts seemed to be scattered in different directions. David's Honda pulled up beside us at a red light, and I waved at Emma, who pressed her face against the window and made silly faces at me. At least the grandchildren still understood how to be present in a moment. Emma was 6 now, old enough to appreciate the park, but young enough to find wonder in simple things like feeding ducks and collecting interesting rocks. She reminded me of David at that age, full of curiosity and joy. "How long do you think we'll stay?" Michael asked as we turned into the park entrance. The question was casual, but I heard the underlying message. He was already planning his exit strategy. "As long as it takes," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Today is important, Michael, more important than you realize." Something in my tone must have registered because he glanced at me again in the rearview mirror, his expression slightly more attentive. Sarah, however, remained absorbed in her digital world, apparently negotiating something complex via text message. Riverside Park looked exactly as I remembered it, as if it existed outside the normal flow of time. The oak trees were fuller now, their branches reaching further toward the sky, but the basic landscape remained unchanged. The pond still reflected the afternoon light like scattered diamonds, and the ducks still congregated near the walking path, hopeful for visitors with breadcrumbs or crackers. Our traditional spot was available, as it almost always was. The massive oak tree that Harold had claimed as ours stood majestically near the pond's edge, its roots creating natural seating areas that we'd used for decades. The ground beneath it was level and perfect for spreading a quilt, and the branches provided just enough shade to make even hot summer days comfortable. David's family arrived just as we were unloading Michael's trunk. Jennifer immediately began, helping with the picnic supplies, her movements efficient and cheerful. She'd married into our family 12 years ago, and I'd grown to love her practical kindness and genuine warmth. She understood the importance of family traditions in ways that sometimes eluded my own children. "Mrs. Powell, I brought some homemade cookies," Jennifer said, producing a covered container from their car. "Emma helped me make them yesterday. She insisted on using the heart-shaped cookie cutters because she said Grandpa Harold would have liked hearts." The gesture touched me deeply. Jennifer hadn't known Harold well. They'd only been married for a few years before his death. But she'd made an effort to understand what he would have appreciated. It was more consideration than I'd seen from my own children in months. "That's beautiful, dear," I managed, my voice slightly thick with emotion. Harold always said that food made with love tastes better than anything you can buy in a store. Emma bounded over to me with the energy that only 6-year-olds possess. "Grandma Kathy, can we feed the ducks today? Mama packed special duck food, not bread, because bread isn't good for them. Did you know that bread can make ducks sick?" Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I felt my earlier disappointment beginning to lift. At least someone in the family was excited about being here. "I didn't know that, sweetheart. You're very smart to think about what's healthy for the ducks." "Daddy taught me that," Emma said proudly, slipping her small hand into mine. "He knows lots of things about animals and nature." David had indeed inherited Harold's love of learning and his respect for the natural world. Perhaps more of his father lived on in him than I'd dared to hope. As we walked toward our traditional spot, Emma chattering about everything she saw, I felt my optimism returning. The process of setting up our picnic area had its own rhythm, developed over years of practice. Jennifer and I spread the quilt while the men carried the heavier items from the cars. Sarah continued her phone conversation, pacing near the parking area with the focused intensity of someone closing a major deal. Her absence from the setup process felt deliberate, as if participating in family traditions was beneath her professional dignity. Emma helped me unpack the food, her eyes widening when she saw Harold's birthday cake. "It's so pretty, Grandma. Did you make it yourself?" "I did, sweetheart. It was your Grandpa Harold's favorite kind, German chocolate with coconut frosting." "Can we sing happy birthday to him?" Emma asked with the innocent directness that children possess, "even though he's in heaven?" The question caught me, off guard, but in the most wonderful way. Here was a 6-year-old who understood something that the adults seemed to have forgotten, that love doesn't end with death, that celebrations can honor memory as much as presence. "I think that's a beautiful idea," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. "I think Grandpa Harold would love that very much." David overheard our conversation as he arranged the folding chairs. "That's a great suggestion, Emma. We should definitely sing to Grandpa." Michael had finished unloading his contributions to the picnic and was already checking his phone. "How long do you think setup will take?" he asked David quietly, but not quietly enough that I couldn't hear. "I have some calls I need to return before the evening." The casual dismissal of our gathering as merely setup stung. This wasn't preparation for something else. This was the something else. This was the point of our being here together. But I swallowed my hurt and focused on arranging the food, determined not to let anyone's impatience spoil what I'd planned to be a perfect day. Sarah finally ended her phone call and joined us under the oak tree, though she kept her phone in her hand as if expecting it to ring again at any moment. "Sorry about that," she said without really sounding sorry. "The Atlanta clients are very demanding, and this property has been on the market for 8 months. If I can close this deal today, it'll be my biggest commission this quarter." "Business is going well then?" I asked, genuinely interested in my daughter's success, despite feeling hurt by her divided attention. "Incredibly well," Sarah replied, her posture straightening with professional pride. "I'm actually in the running for Agent of the Year at my firm. The recognition would mean everything for my career trajectory." I should have felt proud of her accomplishments, and part of me did. Sarah had always been ambitious and driven, qualities that had served her well in the competitive world of real estate. But listening to her talk about recognition and career trajectories while sitting under the tree where her father used to push her on a tire swing made me wonder when success had become more important to her than connection. "Your father would be proud of how hard you work," I said, meaning it despite my mixed feelings about her priorities. "Would he?" Sarah asked, and for just a moment I heard something vulnerable in her voice. "Sometimes I wonder if he'd understand the choices I've made. He was always so content with simple things." The comment revealed more than she probably intended. There was a part of Sarah that still craved Harold's approval, that questioned whether her pursuit of material success aligned with the values he'd tried to teach her. Maybe there was still time to reach that part of her, to help her. Remember what really mattered. "Your father understood ambition," I said carefully. "He worked very hard to provide for our family, but he also understood that achievements mean nothing without people to share them with." Sarah nodded, but her attention was already drifting, back to her phone, which had buzzed with another message. The moment of vulnerability passed as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her familiar professional armor. Jennifer had been quietly organizing the food while the rest of us talked, and now she clapped her hands together with cheerful authority. "Everything looks wonderful. Should we eat first, or would you like to do the birthday celebration?" The fee? Question hung in the air, and I realized this was my moment. Everything I'd planned, everything I'd hoped for, would begin with my answer. I reached into my purse and felt the reassuring weight of Harold's envelope, the final gift that would show my children how much their father had continued to love them even after death. Actually, I said, my voice carrying a new strength, there's something special I want to share with all of you first, something your father left specifically for this day. Michael's phone disappeared into his pocket with unusual speed. Sarah looked up from her screen, her eyebrows raised with curiosity. David moved closer, and Jennifer gathered the younger children around us. Even Emma seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. I pulled the envelope from my purse, its cream-colored paper catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the oak leaves. Harold's careful handwriting was clearly visible on the front, and I traced the words with my finger before speaking. Your father spent months preparing this before he died, I began, my voice steady but full of emotion. He wanted me to wait, for the right moment, when we were all together and could appreciate not just what he left us, but the love behind it. The family gathered closer, their earlier distractions forgotten in the face of this unexpected revelation. For the first time all day, I had their complete attention. Michael sat forward in his chair. Sarah tucked her phone away entirely, and David moved to sit beside me on the quilt. He told me that this day would come when you were ready to receive his final gift, I continued, holding the envelope carefully, in both hands. He said it would ensure that everyone he loved would be taken care of, that his death wouldn't be the end of his ability to provide for his family. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the pond's edge and the distant laughter of other families enjoying the park. My children's faces reflected a mixture of anticipation, curiosity, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. What is it, Mom? David asked softly, his voice filled with the same gentle patience that had always reminded me of his father. It's everything, I replied, beginning to unseal the envelope with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. It's his love letter to us, his promise that even death couldn't break his commitment to taking care of his family. As I worked to open the envelope, I felt Harold's presence so strongly, it was as if he were sitting beside me under our oak tree, watching his final surprise unfold. This was going to be perfect, I thought. This was going to bring us together, in ways we hadn't been since his funeral. This was going to show my children what really mattered in life. I had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, I would be sitting alone under this same tree, the unopened envelope still in my hands, wondering how I had raised children who could walk away from their mother without a second thought. The perfect day I'd imagined was about to become the most painful awakening of my 73 years of life. But in that moment, surrounded by my family under Harold's oak tree, I still believed in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. I still believed that family meant something sacred and unbreakable. I still believed that the children I'd raised with such care and devotion would never abandon me when I needed them most. I was about to learn how wrong a mother could be about her own children. The envelope opened with a soft whisper of paper, and I carefully withdrew the documents inside. Harold's handwriting covered the first page, addressed to my beloved family, in the formal script he'd always used for important occasions. But before I could begin reading his words aloud, Sarah's phone rang with a sharp, insistent tone that cut through the peaceful afternoon air. She glanced at the screen and her entire demeanor changed, tension replacing the relaxed attention she'd shown just moments before. I'm so sorry, she said, already rising from her position on the quilt. This is the Atlanta client. I absolutely have to take this call. Sarah, can it wait just a few minutes? I asked, still holding Harold's letter in my hands. This is important. Your father. Mom, this could be a 6-figure commission, Sarah interrupted, her phone still ringing insistently. Dad would understand. He was always practical about money. She was already walking away from our gathering, pressing the phone to her ear. "Hello, Mr. Henderson?" "Yes, I've been waiting for your call." Her voice faded as she moved toward the parking area, leaving the rest of us in an uncomfortable silence. Michael shifted in his chair, and I could see him fighting the urge to check his own phone. David looked genuinely disappointed by his sister's departure, but he tried to salvage the moment. "Why don't you go ahead and read it, Mom?" he suggested gently. "Sarah can catch up when she's finished with her call." I looked down at Harold's letter, the words slightly blurred by the tears I was trying not to shed. The moment felt broken now, incomplete without all three of my children present to hear their father's final message. But David was right. We shouldn't let Sarah's absence ruin what Harold had planned. "Your father wrote this 2 weeks before he died," I began, my voice finding strength as I spoke. "He was very weak by then, but he insisted on writing it himself. He said some things were too important to dictate to someone else." Michael leaned forward, his lawyer's training making him naturally interested in any legal documents. Jennifer kept the children quiet with remarkable skill, somehow managing to make the moment feel both solemn and comfortable. "My beloved family," I read, Harold's familiar words bringing his voice back to life in my mind. "If Kathy is reading this to you, it means I'm gone, but it also means the time has come for you to receive my final gift. I've spent months working with lawyers and financial advisors to make sure everything is perfect, that every detail reflects how much I love each of you." The words seemed to hang in the spring air, and I could see their impact on my listeners. Michael's professional composure softened, and David moved even closer, as if proximity to the letter could bring him closer to his father's memory. "I know that money can't replace a father's presence, can't fill the hole that death leaves in a family. But I also know that financial security can provide freedom to pursue dreams, to take risks, to choose love over necessity. That's what I want to give you." "Dad was always so thoughtful about everything," David murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Even dying, he was still trying to take care of us." I continued reading, Harold's words painting a picture of careful planning and boundless love. He'd established trust funds for each grandchild's education, ensured that I would be financially secure for the rest of my life, and set aside substantial inheritances for each of our children. But more than the money, the letter revealed the depth of his understanding of each family member's needs and dreams. For Michael, he'd specifically mentioned funds that could allow him to start his own practice if he chose, to step away from the demanding firm where he currently worked. For Sarah, he'd provided resources that could let her invest in her own real estate company rather than working for others. For David, there was enough to pay off his mortgage and establish a college, fund for his children, relieving the financial pressures that came with a teacher's salary. "But there's one condition," I read, and I could hear Harold's gentle humor in the words even across 5 years of separation. "This gift comes with the expectation that you'll remember what really matters. Money is just a tool. Use it to build the kind of life that honors the values we tried to teach you. Use it to create more time for family, more opportunities for kindness, more space for the simple joys that make life worth living." The letter continued for several more paragraphs, filled with specific memories and personal messages for each child. Harold had anticipated that they would be older when they received this gift, more established in their lives, and better able to appreciate both its practical value and its emotional significance. As I neared the end of the letter, I became aware that Sarah's phone conversation had grown louder and more animated. She was pacing near the parking area, gesturing emphatically as she spoke. Occasionally, her voice would carry across the park, fragments of real estate jargon mixing with the more natural sounds of water and wind. "I love you all more than words can express," I concluded, Harold's final paragraph bringing tears to my eyes despite having read it privately several times over the past weeks. Take care of each other. Take care of your mother. And remember that the greatest inheritance I can leave you is the example of how to live with purpose and love. Until we meet again, I remain your devoted husband and father, Harold. The Rai. Silence that followed was profound and sacred. Even Emma seemed to understand that something important had just happened, though she couldn't fully comprehend the implications of what she'd heard. Michael was openly crying, something I hadn't seen since Harold's funeral. David had moved to sit beside me, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture of comfort and connection. "Mom," Michael said, his voice barely audible, "I had no idea Dad had planned something like this. The amount of work this must have taken, the legal complexity." "He wanted it to be perfect," I replied, carefully refolding the letter. He spent hours with his lawyer and financial advisor, making sure every detail was exactly right. He even had backup plans in case laws changed or investments didn't perform as expected. How does this work practically?" David asked, and I could hear him trying to balance emotional processing with practical concerns. "There are additional documents," I explained, patting my purse where the rest of Harold's gift waited. "Account numbers, contact information, for the financial advisor, detailed instructions for each of you. Your father thought of everything." It was at that moment that Sarah's voice rose to a level that we couldn't ignore, her excitement carrying clearly across the park. Yes, absolutely. We can close on Thursday if that works for you. This is fantastic news." Her celebration of her business success, happening simultaneously with our reading of her father's final letter, created a jarring contrast that none of us could ignore. Michael looked uncomfortable, David appeared hurt, and Jennifer seemed embarrassed on Sarah's behalf. "Should we wait for Sarah to finish her call?" Jennifer asked diplomatically, though we could all see that Sarah showed no signs of wrapping up her conversation. "Let's give her a few more minutes," I decided, though I felt a growing disappointment in my daughter's priorities. This was her father's final gift, his last communication with his children, and she was missing it for a business deal. Michael used the pause to process what he'd heard, and I could see him mentally calculating the implications of Harold's gift. "Mom, this changes everything," he said quietly. "The financial security this provides. I could leave the firm, maybe start a practice focused on helping families instead of corporations. Dad always said I was too idealistic for corporate law." The transformation in Michael's demeanor was remarkable. The tense, hurried man who'd driven us to the park was being replaced by someone who seemed to remember his own dreams and values. This was exactly what Harold had hoped for, that his gift would provide not just security, but freedom to choose meaningful work over merely profitable work. "Your father believed in your idealism," I told him. "He always said the world needed more lawyers who cared about justice instead of just billable hours." David was equally moved, though his response was more emotional than practical. "I can't believe he was still looking out for us even after he was gone," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And the college funds for the kids. Emma and the boys will be able to go to any school they want without us going into debt." "That was very important to him," I confirmed. "He didn't want the grandchildren to start their adult lives burdened by student loans the way so many young people are today." Jennifer wiped away tears as she listened to our conversation. "He was such a wonderful man," she said. "I wish I'd had more time to know him better." "He would have loved watching you and David build your family together," I assured her. "He always said that watching his children become good parents was one of his greatest joys." Sarah's phone conversation continued in the background, a constant reminder of her absence from this sacred moment. I found myself growing increasingly frustrated with her divided attention, though I tried to hide my feelings for the sake of family harmony. "Maybe I should go get her," David suggested, glancing toward where Sarah was still pacing and gesturing animatedly. "Let's give her just a little longer," I replied, though my patience was wearing thin. Surely she'll wrap up her call soon. But Sarah's conversation showed no signs of ending. If anything, it seemed to be expanding into new territory, with discussions of property inspections, financing options, and closing dates. Her excited energy was visible even from a distance, and it was clear that she was completely absorbed in her business success. Michael looked at his watch and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, I hate to bring this up, but I do have a conference call scheduled for 5 o'clock. It's with clients in California, so I can't really reschedule." The comment hit me like a physical blow. Here we were, sharing Harold's final gift with our family, processing the profound implications of his love and foresight, and Michael was worried about a conference call. How had I raised children who could prioritize business over their father's last message to them? "How long do you think Sarah's call will last?" Michael continued, apparently unaware of how his question affected me. "Maybe we should just proceed without her and fill her in later." "Fill her in later?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "This is your father's final gift to his family. This isn't something you summarize in a text message or explain over dinner. This is meant to be shared together, as a family." Michael looked genuinely surprised by my reaction. "Of course, Mom. I didn't mean to minimize it, I just thought—" "You thought it could be squeezed in between more important obligations," I finished, my disappointment finally breaking through my attempts at diplomacy. Just like Sarah thought she could take a business call in the middle of our family gathering. The tension that had been building all afternoon finally erupted into the open. David tried to mediate. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, and the children sensed the adult conflict even if they didn't understand its source. "Mom, that's not fair," Michael protested. "We're all here. We're all participating. But we also have responsibilities." "Responsibilities," I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "What about your responsibility to honor your father's memory? What about your responsibility to be present for your family?" The argument that followed was painful and revealing, bringing to the surface years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. Michael insisted that he was honoring Harold's memory by being successful and financially responsible. I argued that success without presence was meaningless, that Harold would have been heartbroken to see his children treating family time as an inconvenience to be managed around more important obligations. Sarah's phone conversation continued throughout our argument, her oblivious celebration of her business success providing a soundtrack to our family conflict. The contrast was almost surreal, her joy over a real estate commission happening simultaneously, with our argument about family priorities and our reading of Harold's final letter. "Maybe we should continue this another time," David suggested quietly, trying to restore peace to our gathering. "When everyone can be fully present." "Another time?" I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. "Your father has been dead for 5 years, David. I've been waiting 5 years for the right moment to share his final gift with you. How many more years should I wait for my children to make time for their family?" The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see their impact on both Michael and David. They looked genuinely stricken, as if they were suddenly seeing our gathering through my eyes and understanding how their behavior had affected me. But before either of them could respond, Sarah's voice rose in another peak of excitement. "Absolutely! We can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. This is going to be the biggest deal of my career." Her timing was impeccable in its awfulness. Here we were, having a painful conversation about family priorities and the meaning of Harold's gift, and Sarah chose that moment to celebrate her business success with maximum enthusiasm. Something inside me finally snapped. The disappointment, hurt, and frustration that had been building all afternoon reached a breaking point. I stood up from the quilt with a decisive movement that surprised everyone, including myself. "I need a few minutes alone," I announced, my voice steady but filled with unmistakable finality. "To think about what your father would say if he could see how this day has turned out." "Mom, don't," David started, but I was already walking. Away from our picnic area, Harold's precious envelope clutched tightly in my hands. I walked toward the pond, needing distance from the conflict and clarity about what to do next. The ducks were swimming lazily in the afternoon sunlight, completely oblivious to the human drama unfolding nearby. I envied their simplicity, their ability to exist in the moment without the complications of disappointment and unmet expectations. Behind me, I could hear Michael and David talking in urgent, hushed tones. Jennifer was trying to keep the children entertained and distracted from the adult tension, and Sarah's voice continued its celebratory monologue, apparently having no idea that anything was wrong. As I stood by the water's edge, Harold's envelope in my hands, I made a decision that would change everything. If my children couldn't appreciate the gift their father had prepared for them, if they couldn't make time to honor his memory and be present for their family, then perhaps they weren't ready to receive what he'd left them. The envelope felt heavier than ever as I tucked it back into my purse. Harold's final gift would have to wait for a family that was worthy of it, and I was beginning to suspect that might not be the family I'd raised. When I returned to our picnic area a few minutes later, my face must have revealed my decision because David immediately stood up with concern written across his features. "Mom, are you okay? We've been talking," and Michael canceled his conference call. "We want to finish reading Dad's letter together." I looked at Michael, who nodded earnestly. "It's true, Mom. I called my office and rescheduled everything. This is more important." For a moment, I felt hope returning. Perhaps the argument had served a purpose, had reminded them of what really mattered. Perhaps we could still salvage this day and Harold's carefully planned surprise. But then Sarah's voice cut through the afternoon air once again, louder and more excited than before. "Yes, I can absolutely meet you at the property in an hour. This is perfect timing." She was already gathering her things, clearly preparing to leave. The sight of her packing up while her father's letter lay unfinished on our picnic quilt was more than I could bear. "Sarah," I called out, my voice carrying across the park with an authority that made her pause mid-stride. She turned toward me, phone still pressed to her ear, her expression impatient. "Just a minute, Mom. I'm almost finished here." "No," I said, walking toward her with determined steps. "You're finished now. Either you end that call and come back to your family, or you leave, but you don't get to do both." The ultimatum surprised everyone, including myself, but I meant every word. I was done watching my daughter treat her father's memory and her family's time as secondary to her business interests. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, clearly torn between her business opportunity and the unusual firmness in my voice. She said something into her phone, then lowered it slightly. "Mom, this is really important. Can't we just what?" I interrupted. "Can't we just let you leave in the middle of your father's birthday celebration to chase another commission? Can't we just accept that making money is more important to you than honoring the man who raised you?" The confrontation was public now, visible to other families in the park and impossible to ignore. Michael and David had both risen from their chairs, uncertain whether to intervene or let the conflict play out. Sarah's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That's not fair, Mom. You know I loved Dad, but I also have responsibilities, obligations to my clients." "Your father is dead, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through her excuses with brutal clarity. "He's been dead for 5 years. How many more chances do you think you'll get to honor his memory with your family?" The words hung between us like a challenge, and I could see Sarah struggling with her response. Her phone was still active in her hand, her client presumably, waiting for her return to their conversation. "I'll call you back in 5 minutes," she said into the phone, finally ending the call. But her body language made it clear that this was a temporary pause, not a genuine commitment to staying. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed her gesture was sincere. Sarah walked back toward our picnic area, but her movements were hurried and impatient. She sat down on the edge of the quilt, but didn't relax into the gathering way the rest of us had. Instead, she perched as if ready to spring back into action at any moment. "Okay," she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "I'm here. Let's finish whatever Dad left for us so I can get back to my client." The casual dismissal of Harold's gift as whatever Dad left for us was like a slap across my face. This wasn't just money or documents. This was her father's final expression of love, his last communication with his children, his carefully planned legacy for the family he'd spent his life providing for. I looked around at my 3 children, sitting together under Harold's oak tree but miles apart in spirit. Michael was checking his watch despite having canceled his conference call. Sarah was fidgeting with her phone, clearly counting the minutes until she could return to her business deal. Even David, who had been the most present and engaged, seemed distracted by the conflict that had erupted around us. This wasn't the family gathering Harold had envisioned when he planned his final gift. This wasn't the loving, connected family that deserved to receive his legacy. These weren't children who would honor his memory or use his gift to build the kind of meaningful life he'd hoped for them. The realization hit me with devastating clarity. I had failed as a mother. Somehow, despite Harold's example and our best efforts, I had raised children who valued success over relationships, who treated family time as an inconvenience, who could walk away from their father's final gift to chase business opportunities. "You know what?" I said, standing up from the quilt with sudden decisiveness. "I think I've made a mistake." "What do you mean?" David asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I mean that your father spent months preparing a gift for children who would appreciate it, who would understand its significance, who would be present enough to receive it properly." I looked at each of them in turn, seeing them clearly for, perhaps the first time. "I don't think those children are here today." "Mom, that's not—" Michael started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Michael, you've been worried about your conference call since we arrived. Sarah, you've taken 3 business calls and are clearly planning to leave early for another appointment. And David." I paused, looking at my youngest son, who had always been my hope for carrying forward Harold's values. "David, you're the only one who seems to understand that this day is supposed to be about family, but even you seem ready to give up and try again another time." The truth of my words settled over our gathering like a heavy blanket. Nobody could deny the accuracy of my observations, though I could see they wanted to argue with my conclusions. "Your father's gift isn't just money," I continued, my voice growing stronger with conviction. "It's a test. It's his way of seeing whether the children he raised would be worthy of his sacrifice, whether they learned the values he tried to teach them." "Mom, you're being dramatic," Sarah began, but I cut her off. "Am I? Your father worked 2 jobs, for 5 years to pay for your college education, Sarah." The silence that followed my unfinished sentence stretched endlessly under the oak tree. I could see my words had struck deep, but instead of the shame or self-reflection I'd hoped for, I watched my children's faces harden with defensive anger. The afternoon sun seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows that divided our family gathering into fragments of light and darkness. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice cold and clipped. "Mom, I think you're being incredibly unfair. We all loved Dad, and we're all here honoring his memory in our own ways. Just because we have adult responsibilities doesn't mean we don't care about family." "Adult responsibilities," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. "Is that what we're calling it when you abandon your family for money?" The accusation hung in the air between us, and I watched Sarah's face flush with anger and hurt. But before she could respond, her phone rang again. The sharp electronic sound cut through our emotional standoff like a knife, and for a moment, we all stared at the device in her hand. Sarah looked down at the screen, then back at me, then at the phone again. I could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. Her client was calling back, probably wondering why they're important. Conversation had been interrupted. The biggest commission of her career was waiting, requiring only that she prioritize business over whatever family drama was unfolding at a park. "I have to take this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied, my voice steady and final. "You don't." But Sarah was already answering the call, turning away from our gathering as she spoke. "Hi, Mr. Henderson. Yes, I'm so sorry about the delay. Where were we?" That was the moment something inside me broke completely. Not cracked or bent, but shattered beyond any possibility of repair. I watched my daughter choose a stranger's business deal over her father's final gift. Watched her walk away from our family gathering for the second time in less than an hour. And I understood with crystal clarity that I had been living in a fantasy. The children I thought I'd raised, the family I believed we'd built, the values I assumed we'd instilled, none of it was real. Or perhaps it had been real once, but somewhere along the way, the world had taught my children different lessons than the ones Harold and I had tried to share. Michael cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mom, maybe we should reschedule this for another day, when everyone can be fully present without distractions." Another day. As if Harold's birthday was just another arbitrary date on the calendar. As if the significance of this annual tradition could be transferred to whatever Saturday happened to be convenient for everyone's schedules. The suggestion revealed how little Michael understood about what this day meant to me, how completely he'd missed the point of everything we'd been trying to do. "There won't be another day, Michael," I said quietly, and something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. "This was it. This was your chance to show that you understood what your father tried to teach you, what this family is supposed to mean." "Mom, you're being melodramatic," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're all here. We all care. Can't we just work through this?" Work through this, as if the fundamental failure of character I was witnessing could be resolved, with better communication or adjusted schedules. As if the problem was logistics rather than priorities, misunderstanding rather than moral bankruptcy. I looked at David, my youngest son, who had always been my greatest hope for carrying forward Harold's legacy. Even he didn't understand. Even he thought this was just a family argument that could be smoothed over with patience and compromise. The realization that I'd failed with all three of my children hit me like a physical blow. "I need to be alone. For a while," I announced, gathering my purse and Harold's precious envelope, "to think about what comes next." "Mom, don't leave," David pleaded, rising from the quilt. "We can figure this out. We can make this work." But I was already walking away, leaving them sitting under Harold's oak tree with the remnants of our interrupted celebration. Behind me, I could hear Jennifer trying to explain to the children why Grandma seemed upset. Could hear Michael and David discussing in urgent whispers whether one of them should follow me. Let them discuss, I thought bitterly. Let them analyze and strategize and apply their adult problem-solving skills to the situation they'd created. None of it would change the fundamental truth I'd discovered today. My children were strangers to me, and I was apparently a stranger to them as well. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the park, my feet following familiar paths that Harold and I had walked countless times over the decades. The spring flowers were blooming everywhere, daffodils, and tulips and the early azaleas that he'd always loved. He should have been here to see them. Should have been sitting under our tree listening to his grandchildren's chatter and sharing stories about when their parents were young. Instead, he was gone, and the children he'd worked so hard to provide, for couldn't spare a few uninterrupted hours to honor his memory. The irony was devastating. Harold had sacrificed time with his family to ensure their financial security, and now they were sacrificing time with family to pursue their own financial success. The cycle was complete, and it was utterly hollow. Other families were scattered throughout the park, and I found myself observing them with new eyes. A young couple was teaching their toddler to feed the ducks, all three of them completely absorbed in the simple joy of the moment. A group of teenagers was playing frisbee, their laughter carrying across the water. An elderly man was sitting, alone on a bench, reading a book and occasionally looking up to watch the world around him with peaceful contentment. Everyone seemed to understand something that my own family had forgotten. That presence was a gift, that attention was a form of love, that moments like these were precious precisely because they couldn't be bought or scheduled or optimized for maximum efficiency. I found myself at the far end of the park, near the old wooden bridge that crossed the narrowest part of the pond. Harold and I used to bring the children here when they were small, and they'd drop sticks into the water on one side and run to the other side to watch them emerge. Such a simple game, but it had entertained them for hours. When had they stopped, finding joy in simple things? When had they learned to measure every experience by its practical value or financial potential? The bridge was empty now except for me, and I leaned against the wooden railing and tried to process what had just happened. For months, I'd been planning this day. For years, I'd been waiting for the right moment to share Harold's final gift. And in less than an hour, my children had proven themselves unworthy of what their father had prepared for them. But perhaps that wasn't entirely fair. Perhaps the fault was mine as much as theirs. Perhaps I'd enabled their behavior over the years, made excuses for their absence, accepted their divided attention as normal rather than demanding better. Perhaps I'd failed to model the kind of boundaries that would have taught them to prioritize family relationships over professional obligations. Harold would have handled this differently, I realized. He wouldn't have tolerated Sarah taking business calls during family time, wouldn't have accepted Michael's constant preoccupation with work, wouldn't have let any of us treat family gatherings as inconveniences to be endured. He'd been the one who enforced family dinners, who insisted on technology-free zones during important conversations, who made it clear that some things were sacred and not subject to negotiation. After his death, I'd been so afraid of losing my children entirely that I'd accepted whatever scraps of attention they were willing to give me. I'd convinced myself that any time together was better than no time at all, that I should be grateful for their presence even when they were mentally and emotionally elsewhere. Standing on that bridge, watching the water flow steadily toward some distant destination, I understood that my accommodation had been a mistake. By accepting less than what I deserved, I'd taught my children that less was all they needed to give. By tolerating their disrespect, I'd enabled it to continue and grow worse over time. The sound of footsteps on the wooden planks behind me interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see David approaching, his face creased with concern and something that might have been genuine regret. "Mom," he said softly, stopping a few feet away from me. "I came to apologize. You're right about everything. We've been treating this day like just another obligation instead of understanding what it means to you." His words were exactly what I'd hoped to hear earlier, but now they felt too little and too late. The damage had been done, the truth had been revealed. My children might feel momentary guilt about their behavior, but would they actually change? Would they prioritize family over career ambitions tomorrow, next week, next year? "Thank you for saying that, David," I replied, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "But I'm not sure apologies fix what's been broken here." "What do you mean?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "We can go back, finish reading Dad's letter, have the celebration you planned. Michael canceled his call, and Sarah will finish her business soon." Sarah will finish her business soon. Even in his apology, David was making excuses for his sister, accepting that her business took priority over family time. He didn't understand that the problem wasn't the scheduling conflict, it was the choice itself, the casual assumption that money mattered more than relationships. "David, do you really think your father would be proud of how today went?" I asked, turning to face him fully. "Do you think he'd understand why Sarah chose a business call over his final letter? Why Michael was more worried about his conference than about being present for his family?" David's face crumpled slightly, and I could see him trying to find a way to defend his siblings while acknowledging the truth of my questions. Dad always understood about work responsibilities, he said finally. He worked hard, too, made sacrifices for the family. He worked hard so that you wouldn't have to choose between family and financial security, I corrected. He made sacrifices so that his children could have both. But instead of using the foundation he built to create more time for relationships, you've used it to justify spending even less time together. The words were harsh but true, and I could see them landing with painful accuracy. David looked genuinely stricken, as if he was seeing our family dynamics clearly for the first time. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. "What do you want us to do?" The question hung between us, and I realized I didn't have a clear answer. What did I want? An apology? A promise to do better? A commitment to different priorities? All of those things felt insufficient after what I'd witnessed today. "I want to go home," I said finally. "I want to think about what your father would say if he could see what his family has become." "Don't leave angry, Mom," David pleaded. "Let's go back and finish the celebration. Let's make this right." But I was already walking past him, heading back toward the parking area where I could see Michael and Jennifer packing up our picnic supplies. The celebration was over. Had been over from the moment Sarah chose to answer her phone instead of listening to her father's final words. As I approached our traditional spot under the oak tree, I could see the remnants of what should have been a perfect day. Harold's birthday cake sat untouched on its glass pedestal. The picnic basket was half-packed, sandwiches still wrapped and waiting to be eaten. The quilt was rumpled and partially folded, but the corner where I'd been sitting still held the impression of my body. Michael looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of guilt and frustration. "Mom, David told us what you said about Dad being disappointed in us. That's not fair. We're doing our best to balance everything." "Your best." The phrase that every parent hears when their children want to excuse behavior that falls short of expectations. Michael's best apparently included checking his phone every 5 minutes and worrying about conference calls during family gatherings. Sarah's best meant prioritizing client relationships over her father's memory. Even David's best hadn't been enough to recognize how hurtful their behavior had been until I'd spelled it out for him. "Where's Sarah?" I asked, though I could already hear her voice in the distance, still engaged in animated conversation with her client. "She's finishing up her call," Michael said defensively. "She'll be back in a few minutes, and then we can continue with Dad's letter." Continue with Dad's letter. As if Harold's final communication with his children was a television program that could be paused and resumed at their convenience. As if the sacred moment we'd been building could be reconstructed after being shattered by their casual disregard. "No," I said quietly, reaching into my purse and withdrawing Harold's envelope. "We won't be continuing with your father's letter." Both Michael and David looked alarmed by my tone and the finality in my voice. Jennifer had stopped packing and was watching our interaction with growing concern. "Mom, what are you saying?" David asked, stepping closer to me. "I'm saying that your father spent months preparing a gift for children who would appreciate it, who would understand its significance, who would be present enough to receive it properly." I held the envelope carefully in both hands, feeling its weight and importance. "You've proven today that you're not those children." "That's not true," Michael protested, his lawyer's training making him instinctively argue against any conclusion. That didn't favor his position. "We appreciate Dad's thoughtfulness. We understand how much this means to you. We just have other responsibilities." "Other responsibilities," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger with conviction. "More important responsibilities than honoring your father's memory. More urgent responsibilities than spending uninterrupted time with your 73-year-old mother. More valuable responsibilities than receiving the final gift from the man who sacrificed everything to give you opportunities." The accuracy of my words silenced Michael's protests. He couldn't argue with the fundamental truth of what I was saying, couldn't deny that their behavior had revealed their priorities with devastating clarity. Jennifer cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Powell, maybe we could all take a step back. And—" "No, dear," I said gently, not wanting my disappointment in my children to affect my relationship with her. "This isn't something that can be fixed with better communication or second chances. This is about character, about values, about what kind of people my children have chosen to become." Sarah's laughter carried across the park, bright and celebratory as she continued her business negotiations. The sound felt like salt in an open wound, a constant reminder that she'd chosen financial success over family connection at the most important moment. "I'm leaving," I announced, tucking Harold's envelope back into my purse. "I need time to think about what to do with your father's gift, since it's clear that none of you are ready to receive it." "Mom, please don't do this," David begged, genuine distress in his voice. "Don't let one bad afternoon destroy our family." One bad afternoon. That's how he saw it. A single moment of poor timing rather than a revelation of deeper problems. He didn't understand that this wasn't about one afternoon, but about years of accumulated disrespect, months of divided attention, decades of taking family relationships for granted. "This afternoon didn't destroy our family, David," I replied sadly. "It revealed that our family was already destroyed. I just didn't want to see it before now." I walked toward the parking area, leaving my children standing under Harold's oak tree with the remnants of their father's birthday celebration. Behind me, I could hear urgent, whispered conversations. Someone calling my name, the sound of Jennifer trying to explain to the grandchildren why their planned picnic was ending so abruptly. But I didn't turn around. For the first time in years, I was choosing my own dignity over their comfort, my own needs over their convenience. Harold would have been proud of me for finally setting boundaries, for refusing to accept behavior that fell so far short of the values we'd tried to instill. As I reached my car, I realized I didn't have a way to get home. Michael had driven me to the park, and his car keys were presumably still in his pocket. For a moment, I stood beside my vehicle feeling foolish and stranded, my dramatic exit undermined by practical logistics. "Mom!" David called out, jogging toward me with my car keys in his hand. "You forgot these." I looked at the keys, then at my son's face, seeing genuine remorse and confusion there. He was trying to understand what had gone wrong, trying to figure out how to fix whatever had been broken. But some things couldn't be fixed, only accepted and grieved. "Thank you," I said, taking the keys from his hand. "Tell your brother and sister that when they're ready to prioritize family over everything else, they can contact me. Until then, I need some space to figure out what comes next." "Mom, this is crazy," David protested. "We're family. We work through problems together. We don't just walk away." "Don't we?" I asked, looking back toward where Sarah was still engaged in her phone conversation. "Isn't that exactly what your sister just did? Walked away from her family for the sake of a business deal?" David followed my gaze and saw Sarah pacing near the picnic area, still deep in conversation with her client, completely oblivious to the family crisis unfolding around her. The sight seemed to deflate some of his righteous indignation about my departure. "She'll finish soon," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And then what? She'll give us her partial attention until the next important call comes in? She'll participate in our family gathering until something more profitable demands her focus?" I shook my head sadly. "That's not family, David. That's just people who happen to share DNA occupying the same space temporarily." I got into my car, started the engine, and rolled down the window to say goodbye to my youngest son. He looked lost standing there, caught between loyalty to his siblings and recognition that I might be right about our family's dysfunction. "I love you all," I said, meaning it despite everything that had happened. "But love isn't enough if it's not accompanied by respect, by presence, by genuine priority. Your father understood that. I hope someday you will too. I drove away from Riverside Park slowly, watching in my rearview mirror as David walked back toward the oak tree where Michael and Jennifer waited with the children. Sarah was still on her phone, still conducting the business that was more important to her than her father's birthday celebration. The drive home felt longer than usual, though the distance was exactly the same as it had been that morning. Everything looked different now. The familiar streets, the neighborhood houses, even my own driveway when I finally reached it. I was returning to the same physical space I'd left a few hours earlier. But I was a different person than the woman who had been so excited about sharing Harold's gift with her family. Inside my house, the silence felt profound and absolute. No phone conversations, no urgent business calls, no divided attention or competing priorities. Just peace and the space to think clearly about what had happened and what it meant. I sat in Harold's old recliner, the one I'd kept in exactly the same position since his death, and pulled his envelope from my purse. The cream-colored paper looked the same as it had that morning, but its significance felt completely different now. Instead of a gift waiting to be shared with grateful children, it felt like evidence of Harold's misplaced faith in the family we'd raised together. What would I do with his legacy now? The financial advisors would need instructions, the legal documents would require decisions, the carefully planned distribution of assets would have to be reconsidered. Harold had assumed his children would be worthy recipients of his generosity, would use his gift to build meaningful lives focused on family and service, rather than accumulation and status. He'd been wrong about that, just as I'd been wrong about the people our children had become. But unlike Harold, I was still alive, to correct the mistake, still able to ensure that his sacrifice went to people who would truly appreciate and honor it. The idea that began forming in my mind felt both radical and completely natural. If my children couldn't appreciate Harold's gift, perhaps there were others who would. If his own family wouldn't honor his values, perhaps strangers would prove more worthy of his generosity. I thought about the young couple I'd seen at the park, teaching their toddler to feed the ducks with such patience and joy. I thought about the elderly man reading peacefully on the bench, content with simple pleasures. I thought about Jennifer, who had shown more respect for Harold's memory today than his own children had managed. There were people in the world who understood what Harold had valued, who lived the kind of lives he'd tried to model. Perhaps his legacy would be better served by supporting them, rather than enabling my children's pursuit of professional success at the expense of everything else. The phone rang 3 times during my first hour home, but I didn't answer it. I could see from the caller ID that it was David, probably trying to mediate some kind of reconciliation, probably hoping to smooth over the afternoon's conflict with promises that next time would be different. But I'd heard those promises before, after other disappointing family gatherings, other instances of divided attention and competing priorities. Nothing had changed because nothing had been required to change. I'd always been the one to compromise, to accept less than I deserved, to make excuses for behavior that fell short of basic respect. Not anymore. Harold's gift had shown me what I needed to know about my children's character, and their behavior today had revealed the depth of my failure as a mother. I'd raised children who could walk away from their father's final message to chase business, opportunities, who could treat family time as an inconvenience to be minimized and managed. The realization was painful beyond description, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I could see my situation clearly, without the filter of maternal hope and denial. My children were adults who had made their choices about what mattered to them, and those choices didn't include prioritizing family relationships. That was their right, but it was also my right to respond accordingly. If they wanted to treat me as an obligation rather than a priority, if they wanted to honor their father's memory with divided attention and grudging participation, then they could face the consequences of those choices. Harold's envelope sat on the table beside me, containing documents that could change my children's lives, could provide them with financial freedom and security beyond anything they'd dreamed possible. But freedom and security meant nothing if they weren't accompanied by wisdom, gratitude, and genuine appreciation for the sacrifice that had made them possible. Tomorrow, I would begin making phone calls. Not to my children, but to organizations that supported families in need, charities that helped elderly people maintain their independence, foundations that provided educational opportunities for children whose parents couldn't afford them. There were people in the world who would understand the value of Harold's gift, who would use it to build the kind of lives he'd always believed in. My children had proven they weren't those people. But perhaps, through redirecting Harold's legacy, I could still honor his memory and values even if his own family had forgotten them. The decision felt both heartbreaking and necessary, both devastating and empowering. I was grieving the family I'd thought I had while simultaneously taking action to ensure that Harold's sacrifice wouldn't be wasted on people who couldn't appreciate it. Outside my window, the spring evening was settling into dusk, and I could see families in neighboring houses gathering for dinner, sharing their days, spending time together without the constant distraction of business calls and professional obligations. They understood something my children had forgotten. That presence was precious, that attention was a form of love, that family relationships required the same care and priority as any other important commitment. Harold's envelope waited beside me, heavy with possibility and promise. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of redirecting his gift toward people who would truly honor his values. Tonight, I would grieve the children I'd thought I'd raised and the family I'd believed we were. The phone rang again, but I let it go to voicemail. Whatever my children wanted to say to me now, whatever explanations or apologies or promises they wanted to offer, could wait. I needed this time to process what had happened, to understand the full implications of their choices, and to plan what came next. For 73 years, I'd put other people's needs and comfort ahead of my own. I'd made excuses for behavior that didn't meet my standards, accepted less than I deserved, and convinced myself that accommodation was the same as love. Harold's gift had given me the power to change that pattern, to finally require the respect and priority that I'd been too afraid to demand. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where my values and Harold's memory would be honored even if our own children couldn't be trusted to do so. The decision was made, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace with my choice. Morning came with an unusual clarity, as if the events of yesterday had washed away years of accumulated fog from my vision. I woke naturally at 6:30, feeling more rested than I had in months, despite the emotional turmoil of Harold's birthday celebration. There was something liberating about finally seeing my situation clearly, about understanding that the disappointment I'd been carrying wasn't a character flaw on my part, but a reasonable response to unreasonable behavior. I made coffee in Harold's favorite mug, the one with the faded logo from the hardware store where he'd worked for 15 years before starting his own contracting business. Everything in my kitchen held memories, but this morning they felt different. Somehow, less like reminders of loss, and more like evidence of a life well lived, values worth preserving even if my own children had abandoned them. The envelope sat on my kitchen table where I'd left it the night before, its cream-colored paper catching the early morning light. Inside were documents that represented Harold's final expression of love for his family, his carefully planned legacy for children he'd believed would honor his values and use his gift wisely. The irony was devastating. He'd worked so hard to provide for people who had grown beyond appreciation, beyond gratitude, beyond the simple understanding that some things mattered more than money. But that realization, painful as it was, had also revealed a path forward. If Harold's own children couldn't appreciate his sacrifice, there were others who would. If his family wouldn't honor his values, perhaps strangers would prove more worthy of his generosity. I opened the envelope and spread the documents across my kitchen table, reading through them with new eyes and a different purpose. Harold had been thorough, as always. There were account numbers for various investment funds, contact information for financial advisors, detailed instructions for distributing assets among our children and grandchildren. The total value was staggering, more money than our family had ever dreamed of having, accumulated through decades of careful saving and wise investing. Michael's portion alone would have allowed him to leave his high-pressure law firm and start the family-focused practice he'd always talked about. Sarah's inheritance could have funded her own real estate company, giving her the independence she'd always craved. David's share would have eliminated his mortgage and established college funds for all three of his children, removing the financial stress that came with a teacher's salary. But more than the money itself, Harold's gift represented something deeper. His continued faith in his children's character, his belief that they would use his legacy to build meaningful lives centered on family and service rather than accumulation and status. Yesterday had proven how misplaced that faith had been. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them back in the envelope, then reached for the phone book that I still kept in my kitchen drawer, despite living in an increasingly digital world. Some things required the deliberate, methodical approach that only physical resources could provide. The first call I made was to Harold's financial advisor, a man named Robert Chen who had worked with us for over a decade. Robert had helped Harold structure his estate planning, had understood his desire to provide security for his family while encouraging them to pursue meaningful work rather than simply chasing financial success. "Mrs. Powell," Robert said warmly, when his secretary connected us. "How wonderful to hear from you. I was actually expecting your call soon. Harold's instructions were to contact you after 5 years if you hadn't already reached out about implementing the estate distribution." "Yes, about that," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I need to discuss some changes to Harold's original plan." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear Robert shifting papers. "Changes? Mrs. Powell, I have to tell you that Harold was very specific about his wishes. The documents he prepared were quite detailed, and he seemed very confident about how he wanted his estate handled." "Harold was confident about the children he thought he was leaving behind," I replied carefully. "It turns out his assessment of their character was somewhat optimistic." Another pause. Longer. This time, Robert had been in the financial planning business long enough to understand family dynamics, to know that death often revealed uncomfortable truths about relationships and priorities. "I see," he said finally. "Well, as the surviving spouse, you do have certain rights regarding the estate distribution, though Harold did structure things in a way that limited some of your options. Could you tell me more specifically what kind of changes you're considering?" I explained what had happened at the park, describing my children's behavior without editorial comment, simply laying out the facts of their divided attention, their competing priorities, their casual dismissal of family time in favor of business opportunities. Robert listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or concern. "That must have been very difficult for you," he said when I finished. "I remember Harold talking about how important family traditions were to both of you, how much he valued the time you spent together as a family." "He would have been heartbroken," I confirmed. Not angry, just deeply sad to see that the values he tried to instill didn't take root the way he'd hoped. "So what are you thinking in terms of alternative arrangements?" Robert asked gently. "I want to redirect Harold's legacy toward people and organizations that will honor his values," I said, surprised by how confident I sounded. "Charities that support families, organizations that help elderly people maintain their independence, foundations that provide educational opportunities for children whose parents can't afford them. People who understand that money is a tool for building meaningful lives, not an end in itself." Robert was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the legal and practical implications of what I was proposing. "Mrs. Powell," he said finally, "I want to be clear about something. While you do have some flexibility, as the surviving spouse, Harold did establish certain trusts and designated beneficiaries that would be very difficult to change. However, there are other assets, the investment accounts in your joint names, the life insurance policies where you're the primary beneficiary, some of the property holdings that you have complete control over. We're talking about a substantial sum, probably 60 to 70% of the total estate value. 60 to 70%. Even that portion would be more money than most people saw in a lifetime, certainly enough to make a significant impact on the causes and people Harold had cared about. That would be sufficient, I told Robert. Can you prepare a list of those assets so I can see exactly what we're working with? Of course, I can have that ready for you by this afternoon. But Mrs. Powell, I have to ask, are you certain about this decision? Family relationships can be complicated, and sometimes people say things in anger that they don't really mean. Have you considered whether your children might respond differently if they understood the full implications of their behavior? The question was fair, and I could hear the gentle concern in Robert's voice. He'd worked with enough families to know that estate disputes often caused irreparable damage to relationships, that money could reveal the worst in people while simultaneously destroying the very connections it was meant to strengthen. Robert, I said slowly, my children are adults who have made conscious choices about their priorities. Yesterday wasn't an aberration or a moment of poor judgment. It was a revelation of who they've chosen to become. They've shown me that business success matters more to them than family relationships, that money is more important than memory, that convenience trumps commitment. I paused, thinking about how to explain the depth of my disappointment without sounding vindictive or petty. Harold spent his entire adult life making sacrifices for his family. He worked extra jobs to pay for their education, postponed his own dreams to ensure their security, chose family time over personal advancement whenever possible. His final gift was meant to free them from those same pressures, to give them the security he never had so they could prioritize relationships over financial necessity. And instead, they've used that security to justify prioritizing everything else, Robert said quietly, understanding beginning to color his voice. Exactly. They don't need Harold's money to have meaningful lives. They need to remember what meaningful means. And if they can't learn that lesson from their father's example and their mother's expectations, then perhaps his legacy would be better served supporting people who already understand those values. Robert agreed to prepare the documentation. I'd requested and to research the best methods for making large charitable contributions that would honor Harold's memory while maximizing the impact on beneficiaries. We scheduled a follow-up appointment for later in the week to review options and begin the formal process of redirecting Harold's legacy. After ending that call, I sat at my kitchen table feeling both exhausted and energized. The decision was real now, not just an emotional reaction to yesterday's disappointment, but a concrete plan with legal and financial implications. There would be no going back once the process began. No way to undo the choice without devastating consequences for relationships that might already be beyond repair. The phone rang while I was still processing the conversation with Robert. The caller ID showed David's number, and after a moment's hesitation, I decided to answer. Of all my children, David had shown the most awareness of their collective failure. Yesterday, the most genuine remorse for how the day had unfolded. "Mom," he said, relief evident in his voice when I picked up. "Thank God you answered. I've been worried sick about you." "I'm fine, David," I replied, though I wasn't sure what fine meant under these circumstances. "I've been thinking about yesterday, about what it revealed about our family." "That's actually why I'm calling," David said quickly. "Jennifer and I talked for hours last night about what happened, about how badly we handled Dad's birthday celebration. We want to make it right, Mom. We want to do better. We want to do better." The same promise I'd heard after previous disappointing gatherings, previous instances of divided attention and competing priorities. But wanting to do better and actually changing were different things entirely. What does doing better look? Like to you, David? I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Well, first, we want to reschedule Dad's birthday celebration. A proper one this time, where everyone commits to being fully present. No phones, no business calls, no distractions, just family time focused on honoring Dad's memory. And Sarah? Has she expressed interest in this phone-free, distraction-free gathering? There was a pause, and I could hear David's discomfort with the question. She feels terrible about yesterday, Mom. She knows she handled it badly. She wants to make amends. She feels terrible about yesterday, I repeated. Has she said that? To you directly? Or are you interpreting her feelings based on what you think she should feel? Another pause, longer this time. I haven't actually spoken to her yet, David admitted. But I'm sure she regrets how things went. She loves Dad. She loves you. She just gets caught up in work sometimes. Sometimes. As if yesterday had been an isolated incident rather than a pattern of behavior that had been developing for years. As if Sarah's choice to prioritize business over family was an occasional lapse rather than a fundamental expression of her values. David, I said gently, what exactly did Jennifer say about yesterday? What was her perspective on how your sister and brother behaved? I heard David take a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was more subdued. She said it was disrespectful. She said that if someone had treated her father's memory the way Sarah treated Dad's, she would have been devastated. She said, she was embarrassed for you, watching your own children treat family time like an inconvenience. Jennifer's honesty was both painful and validating. She'd seen the situation clearly, without the filter of familial loyalty or the desire to minimize conflict. Her perspective confirmed that my reaction hadn't been oversensitive or unreasonable. It had been the natural response of someone watching their family's values being casually discarded. Jennifer was right, I said quietly. It was disrespectful. It was embarrassing, and it was revealing in ways that go far beyond one afternoon's poor choices. Mom, people make mistakes, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. That doesn't mean we throw away our family relationships. I'm not throwing anything away, David. I'm finally seeing what was already gone. I stood up from my kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where Harold and I had raised our children, where we'd tried to teach them the difference between success and fulfillment. Your sister chose a business deal over her father's. Final letter. Your brother worried about conference calls during a family gathering. And you, the one I'd hoped would carry forward your father's values, you're making excuses for their behavior instead of holding them accountable for it. I'm not making excuses, David said, but we both knew that wasn't true. I'm trying to keep our family together. Our family was already falling apart, David. Yesterday just made it visible. I could hear David struggling with my words, trying to find a way to argue against conclusions that aligned too closely with his own observations to be easily dismissed. So what happens now? He asked finally. Do we just stop being a family? Do we let one bad day destroy everything Dad built? Your father built his life around values that his children have abandoned, I replied. Family first, presence over presents, relationships over recognition. You can't preserve what he built by ignoring the foundation it was built on. But Mom, we can change. We can do better. Give us another chance to show you that family matters to us. Another chance. How many chances did people deserve to demonstrate basic respect and consideration? How many times should I accept promises of future improvement while tolerating present disappointment? David, I've been giving you chances for years, I said, my voice growing firmer. Chances to prioritize family dinners over work obligations. Chances to be present during conversations instead of constantly checking your phones. Chances to treat family time as sacred rather than just another item on your schedule. This is different, David insisted. Yesterday was a wake-up call. We understand now how much we've been taking you for granted. Do you? Has Michael called to apologize for his preoccupation with business? Has Sarah acknowledged that her behavior was inappropriate? Or are you the only one who feels any remorse about what happened? The silence that followed answered my question more clearly than words could have. David was the only one who recognized the magnitude of their collective failure, the only one who understood that relationships required actual effort rather than good intentions. "I'll talk to them," David said finally. "I'll make them understand how much they hurt you." You can't make anyone understand anything, David. Understanding comes from within, from recognizing the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior. Either your siblings see that gap or they don't. Either they care enough to change, or they don't. I walked back to my kitchen table where Harold's envelope waited, its contents representing both his love for his children and his misplaced confidence in their character. "There's something else you need to know," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "Your father left a substantial inheritance for all of you, money that was meant to provide security so you could prioritize family and meaningful work over financial pressure." "Mom, we know Dad was careful with money, but—" "David, I'm talking about life-changing money. Enough to pay off all your debts, establish college funds for your children, allow you to make choices based on values rather than necessity." I could hear David's sharp intake of breath as the implications sank in. "How much money, Mom?" "Enough to transform your lives if used wisely. Enough to honor your father's memory by living according to his values." I paused, letting the weight of Harold's gift settle in David's mind. "Or enough to enable more of the behavior I witnessed yesterday, if that's what you choose to do with it." Are you threatening to withhold Dad's inheritance because of what happened yesterday?" The question revealed how little David understood about the real issue. This wasn't about punishment or leverage. It was about recognizing that Harold's gift came with expectations, that receiving his legacy meant accepting responsibility for honoring his values. "I'm saying that your father's gift was intended for children who would use it to build the kind of life he believed in. Children who understood that money was a tool for creating meaning, not an end in itself." I picked up the envelope, feeling its weight and significance. Yesterday showed me that his children don't exist anymore, if they ever did. "Mom, please don't make any permanent decisions based on one bad day," David pleaded. "Give us a chance to prove that we can be the people Dad raised us to be." "You are the people Harold raised you to be," I replied sadly. "You're also the people the world taught you to become after he was gone. The question is, which set of values will guide your choices going forward?" I could hear David crying on the other end of the line, and my heart broke for him even as I held firm in my conviction. Of all my children, he was the most likely to genuinely change, the most capable of recognizing what had gone wrong and working to repair it. "What would it take?" he asked through his tears. "What would we have to do to prove that family matters more than anything else?" The question was both heartbreaking and revealing. The fact that he had to ask what it would take showed how far removed they'd become from understanding basic family dynamics. The answer should have been obvious. Show up fully, be present consistently, prioritize relationships over professional advancement. "David, I can't give you a checklist for being a good son," I said gently. "Either you understand that family relationships require presence, priority, and genuine investment, or you don't. Either you're willing to make sacrifices for the people you love, or you're not." "I am willing," David said quickly. "I know I haven't shown it consistently, but I am willing to change." "Then change," I replied simply. "Not because of money, not because of inheritance, not because you're afraid of consequences. Change because you recognize that the person you've become isn't the person your father raised you to be." We talked for a few more minutes, with David asking increasingly desperate questions about what he could do to repair the damage from yesterday's gathering. But I could tell he was still thinking in terms of gestures rather than fundamental shifts in priority, still hoping for a quick solution to a problem that required sustained commitment to different values. After ending the call with David, I returned to my research about charitable organizations that aligned with Harold's values. The morning had been emotionally draining, but also clarifying. David's response to our conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. My children were capable of feeling guilt about their behavior, but not necessarily capable of the sustained change that would make their guilt meaningful. The first organization I researched was Families First, a local nonprofit that provided support services for elderly people who wanted to remain in their own homes rather than moving to assisted living facilities. Their website featured testimonials from families who had been able to keep their loved ones comfortable and independent through the organization's programs. Harold would have loved supporting such work. He'd always believed that family connections were strengthened by proximity and daily interaction. The second organization was the Community Education Foundation, which provided scholarships and support services for first-generation college students from low-income families. Harold had been a first-generation college graduate himself, working construction jobs during the day and attending classes at night to earn his business degree. He'd never forgotten how difficult it was to pursue education without family resources or guidance. Each organization I researched revealed new possibilities for honoring Harold's memory while supporting people who embodied the values my children had abandoned. The irony was devastating, but also empowering. Harold's money would create more positive impact in the hands of strangers than it would in the accounts of his own children. The phone rang again while I was reading about a foundation that provided support for teachers in underfunded schools. This time, the caller ID showed Michael's number, and I answered with some curiosity about what my eldest son might have to say about yesterday's events. "Mom," Michael said, his voice carrying the controlled professional tone he used for difficult conversations. "David told me about your call this morning. I think there's been some misunderstanding about what happened. Yesterday, some misunderstanding." Already Michael was framing the conversation in legal terms, as if yesterday's events were subject to interpretation rather than obvious in their meaning. "What misunderstanding is that, Michael?" I asked, settling back into my chair for what I suspected would be a challenging conversation. "Well, David seems to think you're upset about our handling of Dad's birthday celebration, that you feel we weren't appropriately respectful or present." Michael paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I want you to know that we all have tremendous respect for Dad's memory and for the traditions you've established to honor him." Tremendous respect. The kind of respect that included checking phones every few minutes and worrying about conference calls during family gatherings. The kind of respect that prioritized business deals over final letters from deceased fathers. "Michael, what specifically do you remember about yesterday?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on events I'd found so devastating. "I remember a lovely picnic at the park where you shared some documents that Dad had prepared for us. I remember Sarah having to handle an important business call, which was unfortunate timing, but certainly understandable given her professional responsibilities." Important business call, unfortunate timing, professional responsibilities. The sanitized language revealed how completely Michael had missed the point of everything that happened. "Do you remember me reading your father's final letter to his family?" I asked. "Of course. It was very touching, very thoughtful of Dad to prepare something like that. Do you remember Sarah walking away during the reading to take a phone call?" There was a pause, and I could sense Michael's discomfort with the direct question. As I said, the timing was unfortunate, but Sarah has significant responsibilities to her clients, and sometimes business can't wait for convenient moments. "So you believe that real estate negotiations take priority over a father's final letter to his children?" "Mom, that's not a fair characterization of the situation," Michael protested, his lawyer's training making him instinctively argue against any framing that didn't favor his position. Sarah wasn't choosing business over family. She was trying to balance competing obligations in a difficult situation. Competing obligations. That phrase revealed everything I needed to know about Michael's worldview. In his mind, family time and business commitments existed on the same level, deserving equal consideration when they came into conflict. "Michael," I said carefully, "your father worked 2 jobs for 5 years to pay for your law school education. He missed dinners, lost sleep, postponed vacations, and sacrificed time with his family so you could have opportunities he never had." "I know that, Mom. I'm incredibly grateful for everything Dad did for us." "Are you?" Because yesterday suggested that you learned the wrong lesson from his sacrifice. Instead of understanding that family should come first once financial pressure is removed, you've decided that financial success justifies neglecting family relationships. I could hear Michael shifting uncomfortably, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its professional polish. "That's not fair, Mom. I work hard to provide for my family just like Dad did." "Your father worked hard so his children wouldn't have to choose between financial security and family relationships. But you've chosen financial advancement over family connection, even though you already have security." The silence that followed was longer than Michael's usual calculated pauses. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more uncertain. "I don't think I understand what you're asking of us, Mom. We're all successful. We're all contributing to society. We're all raising good families. Isn't that what Dad would have wanted?" The question revealed the depth of Michael's misunderstanding about his father's values and priorities. Success and contribution were important to Harold, but they were never ends in themselves. They were means to creating the time and space for meaningful relationships. "Your father would have wanted you to be present," I said simply. Present. For your children, present for your wife, present for your mother, present for the family traditions that connect us across generations. "I am present," Michael protested. "I was there yesterday. I participated in the celebration." "Michael, you checked your phone 17 times during our 2-hour gathering. You worried aloud about a conference call. You suggested we hurry through your father's final letter so you could meet your schedule." The specific details seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't been aware of his own behavior. That's not presence. That's physical attendance while your mind and priorities are elsewhere. Another long pause, and I could sense Michael genuinely grappling with my observations rather than simply arguing against them. "I guess I didn't realize how my behavior was affecting you," he said finally. "I thought I was managing my responsibilities." "Well, you were managing them efficiently," I agreed. "But efficiency isn't the same as appropriateness. Some moments require our full attention, even if it means other obligations have to wait." "So what happens now?" Michael asked, and I could hear echoes of David's earlier question. "How do we fix this?" The assumption that the situation could be fixed with the right approach or sufficient effort revealed how little Michael understood about what had been broken. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with better time management or more careful scheduling. It was a question of fundamental values and priorities. "I don't know if it can be fixed, Michael," I said honestly. "The damage isn't just about yesterday's gathering. It's about years of treating family time as negotiable, years of prioritizing professional advancement over personal relationships, years of taking for granted the people who should matter most." "But we can change," Michael said, desperation beginning to creep into his voice. "David told me about Dad's inheritance, about how much money he set aside for us. We understand now that he wanted us to use that security to prioritize family over career pressure." The mention of the inheritance confirmed my suspicion that David had shared the details of our conversation. Michael's sudden interest in prioritizing family seemed directly connected to his awareness of the financial stakes involved. "Michael," I said slowly, If the only reason you're willing to change your priorities is because of money, then you've proven exactly why you're not ready to receive your father's gift. That's not— I didn't mean— Michael stuttered, clearly, recognizing how his words had revealed his motivations. Your father's legacy was meant for children who would honor his values because they understood their importance, not because they were financially incentivized to do so. I could hear Michael breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and I suspected he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was at stake. Not just money, but his relationship with me, his connection to his father's memory, his place, in a family that was fracturing along lines of character and priority. Mom, please don't make permanent decisions based on temporary problems, he pleaded. Give us a chance to show you that we can be better. These aren't temporary problems, Michael. They're expressions of who you've chosen to become as adults. I looked out my kitchen window at the spring morning, feeling both sad and resolved. Your father's gift was intended for people who already understood what mattered most. Since his own children don't seem to understand that, perhaps it should go to people who do. The phone call ended with Michael promising to think about everything I'd said and to call back later in the week. But I could tell he was still approaching the situation as a problem to be solved, rather than a character revelation to be acknowledged and addressed. After hanging up, I returned to my research about charitable organizations, feeling more certain than ever that Harold's legacy would be better served supporting strangers who lived according to his values than family members who had abandoned them. The morning's conversations had confirmed what yesterday's gathering had revealed. My children were capable of feeling guilty about their behavior, but not necessarily capable of the fundamental change that would make their guilt meaningful. They could promise to do better, but their promises came only after learning about financial consequences, not from genuine recognition of their moral failures. Harold's envelope sat on my kitchen table, waiting for decisions that would redirect his carefully planned legacy toward people who would truly appreciate and honor it. The choice was both heartbreaking and necessary, both devastating and empowering. For the first time in years, I was choosing my values over my children's comfort, my dignity over their convenience, my understanding of what Harold would have wanted over their sense of entitlement to his gifts. The decision felt like both an ending and a beginning, the end of my illusions about the family I thought I had, and the beginning of a new chapter where Harold's memory would be honored by people who understood the true meaning of his sacrifice. 3 days after my conversations with David and Michael, I sat in the offices of Mercy House, a local organization that provided transitional housing and support services for families facing homelessness. The director, a compassionate woman named Elena Rodriguez, had just finished explaining their programs when I placed Harold's envelope on her desk. Mrs. Powell, Elena said gently, when you called about making a donation in your husband's memory, I assumed we were talking about a modest contribution. This documentation suggests something far more substantial. I had spent the morning visiting 3 different charitable organizations, and each meeting had reinforced my conviction that Harold's legacy would be better served supporting people who understood the value of family, community, and simple human dignity. The families staying at Mercy House weren't there because they lacked character or values. They were there because life had dealt them circumstances beyond their control. My husband believed that everyone deserved a chance to build a stable life, I explained to Elena. He grew up poor himself, and he never forgot what it felt like to worry about basic necessities like housing and food security. Elena nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. We see that struggle every day. Here, families who are working hard but can't quite make ends meet. Children who just need a safe place to call home while their parents get back on their feet. As she spoke, I thought about my own children, who had grown up with every advantage Harold's hard work could provide, yet had somehow lost sight of what really mattered. The contrast was stark and painful. There is one condition, I said, withdrawing a sealed letter from my purse. This donation comes with a specific request about how the funds should be used. Elena accepted the letter with curiosity and respect, understanding that major donors often had particular visions for their gifts. But what she didn't know was that my letter contained instructions that would honor Harold's memory in a way his own children had proven incapable of doing. The letter requested that a portion of the funds be used to create a family preservation program, services designed to keep families together during crisis periods, counseling to help them prioritize relationships over material pressures, and support systems that strengthened family bonds rather than simply addressing immediate needs. Mr. Powell believed that strong families were the foundation of strong communities, I explained as Elena read through my proposal. He would have wanted his gift to help families stay connected to each other, especially during difficult times. Elena looked up from the letter with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Powell, this is extraordinary. The program you're describing could serve hundreds of families over the coming years. But I have to ask, this represents a significant portion of your estate. Are you certain this is how you want to direct these resources? The question was fair and necessary, but it also revealed how little Elena could understand about my situation. She saw an elderly widow making a generous but potentially impulsive decision about her financial future. She couldn't know that I was redirecting an inheritance meant for children who had proven themselves unworthy of their father's sacrifice. I'm certain, I replied firmly. My husband worked his entire life to provide security for his family. Since his family has chosen to prioritize other things, his legacy should support people who understand what he valued most. Elena asked several more practical questions about implementation and oversight, and I was impressed by her thoroughness and genuine commitment to using Harold's gift effectively. This was exactly the kind of stewardship Harold would have wanted. Careful, thoughtful, focused on creating lasting impact rather than impressive numbers. As I prepared to leave Elena's office, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity about what my daughter might finally have to say won out over my desire to avoid another disappointing conversation. "Mom," Sarah said when I answered, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. "David and Michael told me about your calls this week, about Dad's inheritance and your concerns about our behavior at the park. Your concerns." As if my response to their disrespectful behavior was merely a matter of personal preference rather than a reasonable reaction to their abandonment of basic family values. "What did they tell you exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious about how my sons had characterized our conversations to their sister. "They said you were upset about my phone call during Dad's letter reading, and that you're thinking about redirecting his inheritance to charity because you don't think we appreciate family enough." The summary was accurate but sanitized, removing the emotional weight and moral implications of what had actually transpired. Sarah's tone suggested she viewed this as a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right explanation rather than a fundamental revelation about character and priorities. "That's essentially correct," I confirmed. "Although I wouldn't say I'm thinking about redirecting the inheritance. I've already begun the process." The silence that followed was profound, and I could almost hear Sarah processing the implications of what I'd said. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. "Mom, you can't be serious. Dad left that money for us, for his children and grandchildren. You can't just give it away because you're angry about one afternoon." One afternoon. Even now, after conversations with both her brothers, Sarah still didn't understand the scope of what had been revealed at the park. She still thought this was about a single incident rather than a pattern of behavior that had been developing for years. "Sarah," I said carefully, "your father didn't leave that money for the people you've become. He left it for the children he thought he'd raised, the children who would use his gift to build meaningful lives centered on family and service." "We are those children," Sarah protested. "We're successful. We're contributing to society. We're raising the next generation. Isn't that what he wanted?" The same argument Michael had made, revealing how completely both of them misunderstood their father's values and priorities. Success and contribution were important to Harold, but they were never meant to come at the expense of family relationships. "Your father wanted you to be present for the people who loved you," I replied. "He wanted you to prioritize relationships over recognition, connection over career advancement, family time over financial opportunity." "I do prioritize family," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I work hard so I can provide for my children, give them opportunities and advantages." "You work hard so you can feel successful," I corrected. "Your children already have every advantage Harold's sacrifice could provide. What they need from you now is presence, attention, and the example of a mother who understands what really matters." I could hear Sarah breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and I suspected she was beginning to understand that this conversation was different from the countless others where I'd eventually backed down and accepted whatever justification she offered for her behavior. "So what happens now?" she asked finally. "Do we just lose our father's inheritance because we didn't meet your expectations for one family gathering?" The question revealed how little Sarah understood about what was at stake. This wasn't about meeting my expectations. It was about honoring Harold's memory and values. This wasn't about one family gathering. It was about the people my children had chosen to become over the course of years. "Sarah, let me tell you what your father's gift actually was," I said, deciding it was time for the complete truth. "Harold didn't just leave you money. He left you the deed to the family lake house that you've all enjoyed for decades. He left you the rights to his contracting business, which is still generating substantial income. He left you stock options and investment accounts that he'd been building for over 20 years. I paused, letting the magnitude of Harold's gift sink in before continuing. "But more than that, he left you a letter explaining that this wealth came with expectations. Expectations that you would use it to create time for family rather than reasons to avoid family. Expectations that you would honor his memory by living according to his values rather than simply accumulating more wealth." Sarah was completely silent now, and I could sense her shock as she realized the true scope of what she and her brothers had been taking for granted. "The letter specifically mentioned each of you by name," I continued. "He wrote about your ambition, Sarah, and how proud he was of your drive and determination. But he also expressed hope that financial security would allow you to choose clients and projects based on meaning rather than just profit margin." "Mom, I had no idea." "He wrote about Michael's intelligence and legal skills, and his dream that Michael would use those gifts to help families and communities rather than just maximizing billable hours for corporate clients." I could hear Sarah crying now, finally beginning to understand what had been lost in their pursuit of professional success. "And David, he wrote about David's natural compassion and his gift for teaching, and his hope that financial freedom would allow David to focus on being the best father and husband possible, rather than worrying about making ends meet on a teacher's salary." The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and misunderstood priorities. "Harold spent months writing that letter," I continued. "He consulted with lawyers and financial advisors to make sure every detail was perfect. He even included specific suggestions for how each of you might use his gift to build more meaningful lives." "Where is the letter now?" Sarah asked through her tears. "It's with the financial advisor who's helping me redirect Harold's legacy to organizations that will honor his values," I replied. "Organizations that understand family comes first, that relationships matter more than recognition, that presence is more important than profit." "Mom, please don't do this," Sarah begged. "Give us another chance. Let us show you that we can be the people Dad wanted us to be." Another chance. The same plea I'd heard from both her brothers, the same assumption that character could be changed through effort and good intentions, rather than fundamental shifts in priority and purpose. "Sarah, I've been giving you chances for years. said gently but firmly. Chances to prioritize family dinners over client meetings. Chances to be present during conversations instead of constantly checking your phones. Chances to treat family traditions as sacred rather than inconvenient. This time will be different, Sarah insisted. Now that I understand what's at stake? What's at stake isn't money, Sarah. What's at stake is whether you're capable of becoming the person your father believed you could be. Whether you can choose relationships over revenue, family over fame, connection over career advancement. I looked around Elena's office, at the photos of families who had found stability and hope through Mercy House's programs, and I felt more certain than ever that Harold's legacy would create more positive impact here than it would in the bank accounts of his own children. I have to go now, I told Sarah. I'm in the middle of completing some paperwork that will ensure your father's gift goes to people who truly understand its value. Mom, wait. But I had already ended the call. There was nothing more to discuss. No argument Sarah could make that would change my mind about what needed to happen. Harold's letter had been clear about his expectations, and his children had been equally clear about their inability to meet them. Elena had been waiting patiently while I took the call, and now she looked at me with gentle concern. Mrs. Powell, that sounded like a difficult conversation. Are you certain you want to proceed with this donation today? I've never been more certain of anything in my life, I replied, taking out my pen to sign the papers that would redirect Harold's legacy toward people who would honor his memory properly. As I signed document after document, I thought about the families who would benefit from Harold's sacrifice. Children who would have stable homes, parents who would receive support during crisis periods, communities that would be strengthened by the family preservation programs his gift would fund. These were people who understood what Harold had valued most, that family relationships required presence and priority, that true wealth was measured in connections rather than bank balances, that the most important legacy anyone could leave was the example of a life lived according to meaningful values. My children had proven themselves incapable of understanding those lessons, but Harold's gift would still serve its intended purpose, just not in the way any of us had originally expected. The final signature felt both devastating and liberating, marking the end of my illusions about the family I thought I had while beginning a new chapter, where Harold's memory would be honored by people who truly deserved his generosity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.